Since his debut novel Carrie was published back in 1974, Stephen King has gone on to have, quite frankly, a ludicrous amount of his work adapted for the big and small screens. Some of it amazing, some of it, not quite so good. What's the utmost worst? What's the absolute best? That's what we're trying to find out here. And to clarify, no direct-to-DVD movies, TV movies, sequels, or original movies with no King source material are featured on this list. And yes, this topic is extremely subjective, so let us know your thoughts in the comments. With that said, I'm Andrew from What Culture Horror, and here's every Stephen King movie ranked worst to best. Number 50, The Lawnmower Man. A film so bad that Stephen King sued to keep his name out of the title, and won a sum of money for damages when his name slipped into a DVD release. The Lawnmower Man is something you have to see to believe, but even then, you're best steering clear unless you're a Stephen King movie completist. With hilariously awful special effects and offensive portrayals of intellectual disability, The Lawnmower Man follows a scientist, that would be Pierce Brosnan here, who accidentally turns a lonely gardener into a digital menace with superhuman powers. It's as wild as it sounds, but not in a good way. And to think, for those of us old enough to remember the film's release, there was so much hype around The Lawnmower Man, only for it to be a total dud. Number 49, Maximum Overdrive. Not just is Maximum Overdrive a Stephen King adaptation, but it was directed by King himself, the one and only directing credit he has to his name, and that's for a very good reason. Based on his own Trucks short story, Maximum Overdrive is just bad on so many levels as we focus on a group of humans who launch a rebellion when every piece of technology on the planet gains evil sentience due to a passing comet. The action is proper silly but played super straight, and King himself has disowned the film, saying, "I was coked out of my mind all through its production and I really didn't know what I was doing." You never would have guessed. Number 48, Graveyard Shift. Graveyard Shift sits in the highest order of 90s B-movies, so full of naff special effects and derivative twists that it was poorly received upon its release, and is even worse all these years later. Following some nondescript textile workers, including the ever-great Brad Dourif, who find themselves hunted by a giant bat, Graveyard Shift isn't even awful enough to be amusingly bad. It's simply an ugly film, barely assembled, and one that you hope will end sooner than it actually does. Making things worse, that giant bat, it looks like a second-hand Halloween decoration. It's properly rough. Number 47, Silver Bullet. Hard as it may be to believe, Silver Bullet was released 4 years after An American Werewolf in London, a monster movie whose effects are still terrifying and revolutionary to this very day. Silver Bullet obviously didn't get the message though, because does this thing look bad. Gary Busey plays a loving family man with bland results, and Dan Attis' overblown direction does little for the tension of its werewolf terrorizes small town story. Number 46, Riding the Bullet. Published in 2000 as the world's first ebook, and so popular that its release caused a mass internet crash because of all the traffic, Riding the Bullet was a novella King wrote to make sense of his mother's passing, following a suicidal college kid who hitchhikes home to see his ailing mother. The film takes this premise and attempts to make it even more profound, but the sentimentality falls painfully flat, though not nearly as flat as its attempt at horror or David Arquette's abysmally hammy performance. And hey, I usually like me some hammy David Arquette. After all, you cannot kill David Arquette. Riding the Bullet though, it's a film that clearly means well, but unfortunately has no idea how to bring its moving parts together in any coherent way. Number 45, Children of the Corn 2023. The Children of the Corn film franchise so far clocks in at 11 movies, and frankly, only a couple are anywhere close to being decent. Also, only 3 of those had any sort of theatrical release, one of which was the 2023 remake/reboot that was, well, extremely rough around the edges. Despite spirited performances from Alina Kampouris and Kate Moyer, the horror here is too cheesy. The rest of the cast seem largely disinterested, the characters are paper thin, and the visuals are frankly horrendous. Possibly not the absolute worst entry in the Children of the Corn franchise, hey revelation, but it's not far off. Number 44, Cell. Almost a decade after teaming up for the brilliant 1408, John Cusack and Samuel L. Jackson found themselves in the post-apocalyptic thriller Cell, about a zombie virus caused by everyone's mobile phones. Of course, Stephen King can be subtle. This is not one of those times. Cell features unnatural dialogue and sleepwalking performances, all the while offering nothing new to the bloated zombie movie landscape. It's a cautionary tale with no real message, a thriller with no real thrills, and wasting two great stars like Cusack and Jackson is borderline criminal. Number 43, Dreamcatcher. As a huge Jason Lee fan, hey Mallrats fans, and a big fan of Thomas Jane thanks to the likes of Boogie Nights, Deep Blue Sea, and his turn as the Punisher, personally I was so hyped for Dreamcatcher back in the day. Unfortunately, that hype led to total disappointment, with this body horror alien picture falling totally flat, despite a cast that also includes the legendary Morgan Freeman, the great Timothy Olyphant, Damian Lewis, Donnie Wahlberg, plus being adapted and directed by Lawrence Kasdan, who wrote classics like The Empire Strikes Back and Raiders of the Lost Ark. While most of Dreamcatcher is just a little, well, dull, the film also maybe turned audiences off for just being a little too cruel with its story. Number 42, The Mangler. From a Stephen King story, directed by the iconic Tobe Hooper and starring the beloved Robert Englund of Elm Street fame. Yeah, sadly, The Mangler's plot was just too daft to make any sense of. That plot would be a demonic laundry press that eats people, of course. Clunky dialogue, horrible effects, and no real sense of dread, The Mangler is pretty awful, although a smidge entertaining at times. Still, somehow it did manage to bag itself 2 sequels down the line, and they're even worse. Number 41, Dolan's Cadillac. Based on one of King's most ponderous and forgettable novellas, Dolan's Cadillac follows a vengeful widower, played by Wes Bentley, who sets in motion an honestly ludicrous plot to kill Christian Slater's crime boss, who's responsible for his late wife's death. There's something intriguing here, and both Bentley and Slater give the performances that are way above the material, but neither King nor director Jeff Beasley can find that something amongst the melodramatic twists and laughably silly final act. Number 40, The Dark Tower. If these films were ranked on how faithful they are to their source material, the long-gestating Dark Tower would probably come dead last. It's a jumbled adaptation of King's most epic novel series, to be sure, but worse still is how stylistically dull it all is. To his credit, Idris Elba makes for a fitting badass gunslinger. The less said about Matthew McConaughey, the better though. But everything around Idris is merely a thumbnail sketch on the epic thriller The Dark Tower should have been. There's fun references to King's most famous work, sure, but at what cost? Sadly, that fanservice can't make up for how outright generic this thing is. Number 39, Firestarter 2022. This Firestarter remake, directed by Keith Thomas and given a modern setting, is not good. Zac Efron is unconvincing as an embattled single father, the effects look cheap, and the script injects nothing new into the 40-year-old story. These gripes aside though, there is Ryan Kiera Armstrong, who portrays young superhuman Charlie with plenty of humanity and strength, making this redo not an outright stinker. Still, the messy finale and stilted supporting cast mean Armstrong was facing quite the uphill battle here. Number 38, Tales from the Dark Side. The fourth in a series of anthology movies inspired by the works of Stephen King, Tales from the Dark Side is unofficially considered the true Creepshow 3. Featuring many of the same crew members as King's previous anthologies, including writer George A. Romero and makeup guru Tom Savini. Unfortunately, this continuation of the TV series of the same name has too little focus to work as well as it should. There's some interest to be found in the performances, particularly that of a doomed Steve Buscemi, and Savini's practical effects work are as good as you'd always expect, but that's not enough to make up for Tales from the Dark Side's lack of cohesion, its dire attempts at dark comedy, or its ineffective scares. Number 37, Needful Things. Needful Things remains one of Stephen King's craziest novels to date, the tale of a small town with underlying tension that quickly explodes into violence and moral decay when a charismatic shopkeeper rolls in and curses everyone with their wildest desires. The film, to its credit, catches some of the novel's insanity, especially when it comes to Max von Sydow's gleefully twisted performance as a man who may or may not be the devil. The rest of the film, from Ed Harris's embattled sheriff to its final showdown of good versus evil, could have done with more energy, mind, as the horror falls drearily flat as the film progresses. Number 36, Thinner. The problem with Thinner, based on the final novel King wrote under his Richard Bachman pseudonym, is that it's all surface, no meaning. Whilst the novel was both gross and thematically challenging, taking aim at greed and capitalism and sin, director Tom Holland, who famously helmed Fright Night and The First Child's Play, took King's story of an arrogant, overweight lawyer cursed by a gypsy to lose weight until he disappears, and just made it gross. It's perfectly fine as a throwaway body horror, but that's about it, even if one-time RoboCop Bobby Burke tries his absolute best in the lead role. Number 35, Pet Sematary 2019. Much like Firestarter, was anyone clamoring for a Pet Sematary remake? Nah, not particularly. And much like the Firestarter remake, the end result was as to be expected. Pretty dull, fairly uninspired, totally forgettable, and changing certain elements of King's source material in an attempt to make itself stand out. Yeah, that just feels like needless changes for the sake of needless changes. But then, needless is a good word to describe the movie. It's not outright bad, but it's far from genuinely good. Plus, this version of Pet Sematary was responsible for spawning the awful Pet Sematary Bloodlines prequel, which nobody should waste their time on. Number 34, In the Tall Grass. In the Tall Grass was a novella written by King with his oldest son Joe Hill, and it made for a strong, if never transcendent, thriller about a group of people who, well, they get lost in the tall grass. It's there in the title. The film is faithful to its source material, which leaves it feeling a bit stretched amongst the expository dialogue and dim lighting, but the cast, including horror favourite Patrick Wilson, are on fine form as struggling souls desperate for survival, and the tone is thick with effective dread. It works, then it ends. Let's move on. Number 33. Carrie, 2013. Masterfully directed by Brian De Palma back in 1976, Carrie was one of those movies that just had zero need to ever be remade. While the 2013 version is marginally better than the vanilla 2002 made-for-TV remake, it's still fairly vanilla itself, lacking the energy, the dread, and the performances of the 76 film. And poor Chloe Grace Moretz never stood a chance of matching Sissy Spacek's turn as Carrie White, the tortured telekinetic high schooler who gets her explosive revenge on those who bullied her. Moretz can be good in the right role, but she's frankly too bland and undynamic as Carrie, which results in the movie's more erratic moments coming across as pretty dull, which is a shame. Number 32, Creepshow 2. Unlike the first Creepshow, George A. Romero wasn't around to direct here, only to write, and his eye for the macabre is sorely missed. That said, Creepshow 2 isn't a total failure, thanks in large part to its silly but unsettling adaptation of King's short story, The Raft. There's some genuine B-movie thrills here, though they're eventually suffocated by what surrounds it. From a dry story about a Native American curse and the tale of a hitchhiker who's more than meets the eye, it's not horrendous, but it sure is lackluster, particularly when compared to its fantastic predecessor. Number 31, Cat's Eye. Cat's Eye is an anthology movie with vignettes linked together by a mysterious nomadic cat. But that's about the only connection these stories have, either aesthetically, narratively, or tonally speaking. The centerpiece of the film is the brilliant Quitters Inc., starring James Wood as a man desperate to quit smoking. Away from that, Cat's Eye does at times fall a little too much into silliness, with derivative nightmares and an emphasis on gross-out twists. But watch out for Firestarter lead Drew Barrymore though, she's the real star here and she's full of surprises. Number 30, Firestarter, 1984. Speaking of Drew Barrymore, the first adaptation of King's Firestarter was originally supposed to be directed by John Carpenter, and we can only imagine what the famed horror master could have done with this concept. Instead, it was Mark L. Lester, best known for the Arnold Schwarzenegger starring Commando, who was in the director's chair, and the result is solid. Barrymore stars here as the telekinetic Charlie, with Charlie and her father on the run from the mysterious shop organization. It's decent, it's bleak, there's some cracking set pieces, plus George C. Scott gets to devour scenery whenever he's on screen, which always makes for a fun time. Number 29, Mr. Harrigan's Phone. A Netflix movie based on the recent novella of the same name, Mr. Harrigan's Phone is classic King, starring Jaden Martell as an outcast who befriends an old man, played by an excellently creepy Donald Sutherland, and when the old fella dies, he starts to contact the boy from beyond the grave, via the telephone he was buried with. The first half of John Lee Hancock's movie is a tantalizing slow burn, with a touching coming-of-age edge, but once Sutherland is out of the picture and the bodies start piling up, it loses steam a little and slips into being overly sentimental and twist-driven, leading to an emotionally unconvincing finale. Number 28, The Dark Half. In Stephen King's world, there's nothing more inherently terrifying than being a writer, and The Dark Half is the author's most explicit exploration of this theme, following a writer who stops using his pen name only to find his alter ego has become violently real. A ridiculous premise that George A. Romero at least directs with some urgency. The Dark Half has Timothy Hutton on top form as he gets the chance to play a man haunted by his own creation. Away from that, The Dark Half does really only have one trick up its sleeve, meaning it can become a little monotonous as it jumps through its twists. Still, Hutton is having a blast. last here. Number 27, A Good Marriage. A Good Marriage, based on the novella from King's despairing Full Dark, No Stars collection, wasn't well received upon its release, neither by critics nor the daughter of serial killer Dennis Rader, King's inspiration for the story, who accused the author of exploiting her father's victims. Backlash aside, A Good Marriage is actually one of the author's most underrated creations, and the film is a horrifying sight, following a content woman who learns her loving husband is a murderer. It's a touch melodramatic at times, but the atmosphere and performances make it a disquieting experience. Number 26, The Night Flyer. The story of a cynical journalist who hops on the trail of a hungry vampire, leaving everyone it comes across gruesomely murdered. The Night Flyer is as grimy as the newspaper its protagonist writes for, but its mystery is half-hearted, and its horror, aside from some gory violence, fails to leave a lasting impression. That said, the pace is full throttle, and the late great Miguel Ferrer turns in a powerful performance as a journalist who's given up but keeps plodding along until the bitter, bitter end. Typical 90s Stephen King fare, The Night Flyer is neither excellent nor terrible, its potential for greatness as out of reach as its nocturnal killer. Number 25, Secret Window. Another King adaptation about writers having a bad old time of it, Secret Window is a tightly wound thriller about a writer accused of plagiarism by a seemingly deranged man of mystery, throwing him on a collision course with his hidden past and doomed future. The middle of Secret Window languishes through some pretty monotonous procedural stuff, but it still works as a disposable tale of deceit, and finally becomes something great with its horribly hopeless finale. The main holdout here though is Johnny Depp, whose star power stops him short of portraying the struggling everyman the film needed to sell its big twist. Number 24, Children of the Corn, 1984. Years of spoofs and overexposure, and all those ridiculously bad sequels, have rendered the original Children of the Corn quite dated, as its tale of possessed kids with pitchforks and a malevolent god isn't quite as scary as it used to be. It's also not as horrifying as King's short story, but to its credit, it still holds up as an unsettling film, full of spooky imagery and big ideas. King loves throwing kids into turmoil, but with Children of the Corn, he made them the demons, and the results are a creepy feast, familiarity notwithstanding. Number 23, Hearts in Atlantis. An adaptation in the loosest sense of the novella Low Men in Yellow Coats, Hearts in Atlantis is a quiet little drama about a young boy, played by the late Anton Yelchin, who forms a bond with his elderly neighbour, played by Anthony Hopkins. Because this is Stephen King, the old guy, of course, has psychic powers. The film strips away the larger fantastical elements of the source material, which is basically indecipherable for anyone unfamiliar with King's Dark Tower novels, and instead makes it a warm, coming-of-age tale about family found and secrets shared. It's sweet, sad, and its reach doesn't exceed its grasp, even as its many mysteries unfurl. Number 22, Apt Pupil. Another young man befriends older stranger with secrets piece, but a very different one from Hearts in Atlantis. Apt Pupil goes for the disturbing rather than the cheery, and the results are even more profound. The film follows a young boy, Brad Renfro, who befriends a fugitive Nazi war criminal played by Sir Ian McKellen, and the results offer a powerful dissection of human evil, malice, and memory. It was sadly a box office flop, but it inspired Apt Pupil director Bryan Singer to push forward with what would become his first X-Men movie, for which he of course cast Ian McKellen as Magneto. Number 21, The Boogeyman. Maybe it's because of that horrendous Boogeyman trilogy of the 2000s, but few had much excitement for 2023's Boogeyman, which had zero ties to that trilogy and was instead adapted from Stephen King's 1973 short story. Thankfully, this Boogeyman was actually pretty decent, featuring David Dastmalchian in a small, mildly creepy, ultimately haunting role as he sets the table for an evil presence that torments a widowed psychiatrist and his two daughters. Tension is built nicely, the scares are fairly effective, and the themes of grief and trauma are explored in a way that doesn't feel too overdone or too undercooked. Number 20, Cujo. As terrifying as Rachel makes it out to be on Friends, Cujo follows a beloved family dog that catches rabies from a bat and then goes on a killer rampage, trapping the mother and her young son in a car. The image of a doomed and merciless Saint Bernard is grim enough, but the mother-son drama of it all elevates the horror to a new, more emotional level. Grounded by a compelling performance from the fantastic Dee Wallace, Cujo is claustrophobic and tragic, and though some of it lunges a little into the outlandish, it's a troubling horror that rattles with tension, and it embedded itself firmly into pop culture. Number 19, 1408. Based on the story of the same name, 1408 is as simple horror movies come, following a supernatural skeptic, a fittingly terrified John Cusack, who decides to spend a night in a supposedly haunted hotel room. And that's it. Directed by Mikael Hafstrom, the surreal thriller follows Cusack as the walls of reality crumble around him and his mind turns to mush, plagued by images of the dead and hallucinatory happy ever afters. It's an inventive and scary experience, and it also features a stern but petrified Samuel L. Jackson for good measure. Not bad for a film based on the short story Stephen King didn't even plan to finish once he started it. Number 18, Pet Sematary, 1989. While the 2019 Pet Sematary may have been forgettable and totally unnecessary, the 1989 version is a favourite of many a horror fan. King himself actually considers Pet Sematary to be the scariest novel he's ever written, to the point that he nearly threw away the idea when he became so disturbed when writing his 1983 novel. And plenty of that terror is translated to the screen here, as the Creed family suffers great tragedy, and then family patriarch Lewis turns to the eerie cemetery that has the ability to bring things back from the dead. Of course, sometimes dead is better, and director Mary Lambert does a good job in showcasing that message here, complete with some gnarly practical effects work from Dave Anderson. Number 17, It Chapter 2. It Chapter 2 had a lot riding on its shoulders following the success and thrills of its predecessor, which is why what we got, while decent, ended up being a bit of a letdown. The second half of Andy Muschietti's take on It was good, but it didn't come close to reaching the heights of the first movie, not being helped by a bloated 3-hour runtime and a slog of a final showdown with the increasingly less scary Pennywise. With that final showdown, something the 1990s It TV miniseries also had a problem with. However, the performances from both the adult and teenage cast were great. There are some staggering, jaw-dropping set pieces built around the concept of trauma and enduring friendship, and some of the scares do stay with you. Number 16, Dr. Sleep. Over the years, Mike Flanagan has emerged as a true champion of bringing Stephen King's work to the big screen, which isn't surprising given his expert adaptations of horror giants Edgar Allan Poe and Shirley Jackson over on Netflix. Dr. Sleep, crafted as a sequel to Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, follows the adult Danny Torrance as he deals with the lingering horror of his psychic abilities and faces off with a new evil. The results are honestly astounding for long stretches, with Flanagan's eye for the macabre bringing great terror to King's dense but moody novel, and Ewan McGregor working wonders portraying a man lost to his past. However, Dr. Sleep does unfortunately eventually run out of steam, but there's an admirable build-up job before things fall a little flat. Number 15, The Running Man. Amongst the rabid dogs, haunted hotels, tortured writers and vampires, Stephen King, well, Richard Bachman here, released the Running Man novel in 1982, a science fiction action thriller he casually wrote in just 1 week, and that was turned into an Arnold Schwarzenegger vehicle 5 years later. Neither the book nor the film will be remembered as high art, but the pure adrenaline the story boasts, both on the page and on the screen, is too exciting to deny. Full of striking imagery, timely political statements, and booming action sequences. It's also Arnie at his heroic best, taking on fascism and looking fresh in his iconic golden jumpsuit whilst doing it. Number 14, The Dead Zone. So, would you go back in time and kill Adolf Hitler if you could? That's the basic premise of The Dead Zone, which follows a man capable of seeing people's future, an ability that allows him to learn that the future US president will destroy the planet. Starring a haunted Christopher Walken and an arrogant, authoritarian Martin Sheen, the real star of The Dead Zone is director David Cronenberg, this being one of Cronenberg's most underappreciated crown jewels, who injects the thriller with such apocalyptic vision that even its quietest moments roar with impending doom. Politically charged, horribly relevant, and in the end, very tragic, The Dead Zone has it all, from its jolts of terror to intimate character work, and the results are simply unforgettable. Number 13, Gerald's Game. Another Mike Flanagan adaptation, Gerald's Game was based on a novel that never seemed destined for the big screen treatment, but somehow the director found a way to make it sing. This claustrophobic thriller follows Jessie, a career best Carla Gugino, whose abusive husband Bruce Greenwood dies from a heart attack after they get into an argument following some sexy roleplay that takes a dark turn, leaving Jessie handcuffed to the bed, her husband's dead body next to her, and she starts to hallucinate as many shades and secrets of the couple's turbulent marriage come to the fore. Horribly bleak and twisting King's novel into something altogether more terrifying, Gerald's Game is a suspenseful tale of survival that starts with a gut punch and doesn't let up until its despairing final image. Number 12, 1922. Thomas Jane has starred in 3 Stephen King adaptations, including unfortunately Dreamcatcher, and his relationship with longtime King collaborator Frank Darabont almost even landed him the role of Rick Grimes on The Walking Dead. dead. You can clearly see Jane in that famous role, but if he was cast as Officer Friendly, he'd never have made 1922, an adaptation of another full dark no stars tale that follows a bitter farmer who, after killing his wife with aid from their impressionable son, quickly finds his sins can't be as easily buried as a dead body. Jane's portrayal of a disillusioned murderer is an unsettling display, though the true star has to be director Zach Hilditch, who controls 1922's slow burn tragedy with compelling restraint. Number 11, Dolores Claiborne. Based on King's daring novel of the same name, which was written as an informal monologue with no breaks or chapters, Dolores Claiborne stars a rarely better Kathy Bates as a woman accused of murder and forced to reconnect with her estranged daughter, played by Jennifer Jason Leigh. Aspects of the film's structure don't entirely work, perhaps because the novel was so uniquely written, but the parts that do, from Bates' creepy central performance to its hypnotically dreadful exploration of repressed memories and hidden pain, work to envelop you in a world impossible to resist, troubling as its drama may be. Unpredictable and unsettling to the very end, Dolores Claiborne is a brilliant character study, briefly derailed by tired courtroom cliches, and the whole thing will leave you reeling. Number 10, Creepshow. The first chapter in an entertaining partnership between Stephen King and horror maestro George A. Romero, Creepshow is easily their best word together, an anthology that throws caution to the wind and brings plenty of macabre joy to the screen. Embracing the kitsch and quirky nature of the classic EC comics of the 1940s and 50s, Creepshow's 5 stories all bring something different to the table, and King himself even gets to take center stage and star in the lonesome death of Geordie Verrell, as poor Geordie's curiosity at a crash-landing meteorite proves to be his downfall. The Crate likely steals the show here, with the brilliant Adrian Barbeau and Hal Holbrook on magnificent form, and there's also appearances elsewhere from some other notable names, such as Tom Atkins, Fritz Weaver, Leslie Nielsen, Ted Danson, Carrie Nye, Ed Harris, E.G. Marshall, Tom Savini, and even a young Joe Hill, that being Stephen King's son. Creepshow is the ultimate love letter to classic horror comic books, and it's nothing if not delightfully sinister and a whole lot of fun. Number 9, Christine. Maybe it's my John Carpenter bias showing, but Christine is absolutely worth a spot in the top 10 of this list. Possibly one of Carpenter's more overlooked and underappreciated movies, this ode to the 1950s centers on a troubled teen who falls in love with a Plymouth Fury. That'd be Christine, and Christine gains sentience and ends up embarking on a murder spree. Based on one of King's most iconic novels, Christine is many things: a surprisingly powerful assessment of Reagan's America, a tragic coming-of-age tale about a boy desperate to become a man, and a slasher movie where the killer happens to be a car, perfectly symbolic of the era it's set in. Stylish, silly, doom-laden, and politically astute, our very own Ewan Patterson has spoken in depth about how great Christine really is, and you can find that video elsewhere on the channel. It's well worth checking out. Number 8, The Mist. There are few Stephen King adaptations with hopeful undertones, though few are as outright bleak as Frank Darabont's The Mist. Taking the premise of King's novella, a small town is engulfed in fog and besieged by hidden monsters, the film mounts an unflinching look at human evil, religious fanaticism, and sacrifice with a star-studded cast, including Thomas Jane and Marcia Gay Harden, unperturbed by the horrors of Darabont's vision. Looking back, this may be the only King adaptation more horrifying than its source material, with a finale so brutal that it stops you dead in your tracks on a first watch. Heck, even on subsequent rewatches, that ending is just utterly grim. With genuine scares and bracing violence, The Mist is a film as unsettling as the monsters that inhabit it, both human and otherworldly. Number 7, The Green Mile. Yet another staggering adaptation from the mind of Frank Darabont. The flaws of The Green Mile are well documented and inescapable, from its crushingly long runtime to its wonky genre mixing. But here's the thing, none of this really matters in the end, because the drama of its story is so shattering, its performances so true, and its conclusions so disarming, that whatever issues The Green Mile has are easy to toss aside and forgive. The story of an innocent death row prisoner, a wretched Michael Clark Duncan, doomed to execution and blessed with healing powers. The Green Mile is the most emotional of Stephen King's movies. Its human touch and slow burn horrors a spell that bewitches and breaks hearts from the very first frame. Number 6, Misery. It's Stephen King's nightmare, and we're just living in it. In Misery, a successful romance writer is saved from a car crash by a maniacal fan who forces him to keep writing the novel series he plans to abandon after his newest book. Frighteningly intense, Misery is a film with big performances, from Kathy Bates' unsettling portrayal of the obsessive Annie Wilkes to the agonising work of the late James Caan, who spends the film both mentally and physically trapped. A cautionary tale about stardom and the price of created hubris, as well as a darkly satirical exploration of toxic fandom before the internet made that such a thing, Rob Reiner's Misery is a thriller that feels more real and disquieting with every passing year. Number 5. It. Of all Stephen King's great creations, Pennywise the Dancing Clown, originally portrayed by the great Tim Curry on TV before this movie cast a delightfully creepy Bill Skarsgård, may be the most overtly petrifying. The lead villain of Andy Muschietti's box office smash It, Pennywise is a malevolent creature that terrorizes and murders the kids of Derry, Maine every 27 years, haunting them with their greatest fears while tampering with the city's very soul. At the centre of the film, a gaggle of kids rally to fight their demons, both literally and figuratively, in a bid to save themselves. The results are a menacing fright fest with stunning imagery where no one is safe, and Pennywise reigns supreme as an unforgettable merchant of death. While 1990's It miniseries is absolutely great in and of itself, Muschietti's first It movie took things to an entirely new level, delivering a truly chilling and twisted film that was sadly a little let down by a decent but not great sequel. Number 4. The Shawshank Redemption. Perhaps the most popular of Stephen King adaptations, The Shawshank Redemption is a moving prison drama about a potentially innocent banker accused of murdering his wife, and the men he meets inside the walls of the eponymous prison. Is Andy Dufresne's, Tim Robbins that would be, an innocent man? Are any of these men above the possibility of redemption, whether it's Morgan Freeman's Dealer Red or the film's Callous Warden? Frank Darabont's film has no interest in answering any of these questions. Instead, he gives each man we meet flaws and virtues of equal merit, and allows us to see them for who they are, human beings searching for meaning, hunting for hope, and in the case of poor old Brooks, looking for a reason to hold on. Number 3. Carrie, 1976. Based on King's very first novel, Carrie is a film that contains multitudes, a brutal horror show that turns into a bloodbath, and more poignantly, a brilliant teen drama tackling alienation, angst, first love, and mental torment. The film follows Sissy Spacek's Carrie White, an ostracized 16-year-old with powerful telekinetic abilities, her almost demonic mother, played by the great Piper Laurie, and Carrie's big date for the high school prom, which turns out to be a cruel prank that quickly backfires. Behind all of this is Brian De Palma, crafting a tense, contemplative tale that aches with palpable dread, and when the finale starts to kick into high gear, you don't know whether to rejoice or wince in terror, but you will recognise Carrie's pain as she dishes out her glorious revenge. Number 2. The Shining. Stephen King infamously hated Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of The Shining because, amongst other things, it made Jack Torrance a bad guy rather than a good one forced into evil. It's easy to understand King's misgivings about the film, but not the film itself, which finds Kubrick at the height of his methodical filmmaking powers. This is a slow burn about a pitiful man who torments his family, a thriller about madness that also happens to feature ghosts, mind-reading children, and inescapable mazes. Open to interpretation, full of horrific sights, and relentlessly moody, but also strangely amusing at times, The Shining may not be for Stephen King, but it's still a genuine masterpiece of a movie. Number 1. Stand By Me. I never had any friends like the ones I had when I was 12. Jesus, does anyone? On the surface, Stand By Me is about 4 friends, played by Will Wheaton, River Phoenix, Corey Feldman and Jerry O'Connell, who head out one day to find a missing dead body, as you do. Deeper than that though, it's a film that captures the aching heart of Stephen King's greatest creations. A film about confronting fears, ourselves and each other in a world that will always try to hold us down. It's also a beautiful ode to friendship, with its young cast capturing a world of authentic feeling in their love for each other, particularly a fired up Corey Feldman and a wise River Phoenix, whether they're making jokes, pulling pranks, or admitting devastating truths about their lives. Based on the novella The Body, Stand By Me may not be a horror flick, but it is Stephen King at his most human and universally affecting.